Welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. And on today's episode, Peter and I have a very special guest. He is Ryan Lazarus, a journalist and producer for Subverse News, the media company founded by YouTuber and journalist Tim Pool. Ryan, thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, so why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in journalism and Subverse?
Sure. So let me start with back in 2008, I was in film school. I was finishing up my last year of school. And one thing I'd always thought about is how was I want to fund my own film career at some point. I wanted to make a lot of very controversial movies and TV shows. And I thought it'd be great if I could have the money to do it myself and not have to worry about someone coming over the top and saying, you can't say this, you can't say that, or you must say this, you must say that. So in the beginning of 2008, I was looking for some different, business opportunities. And it was also the same time I started to learn economics. And if you guys recall 2008, especially the fall of 2008, this was when the Great Recession happened. Yeah. And leading up to that point, I started studying some economists that were warning of this big housing bubble that was going to crash and the U.S. economy was going to be in shambles. So this was, months before these things actually happened.
Oh, okay. And
one of the things I started to pay attention to was what was going on overseas, particularly in India, an economy that at the time was growing faster than even China. And it was also far behind China as far as when they really started to grow, and they had a lot of upside. And through a mutual friend, I met an Indian gentleman who had some interesting business ideas and actually ended up dropping out of school my last semester of film school to partner with him. And we began building cell phone towers and other infrastructure projects in remote parts of India. So I've been doing business there for over 10 years, but since then I've had some other entrepreneurial projects. I co-founded a startup called Valkyrie. We patented smart drone delivery mailboxes. So basically the mailbox of the near future. But when I first launched or co-founded Valkyrie with one of my best friends from high school, he asked me, how long, was I thinking of, being involved with Valkyrie? And I told him, 3 to 5 years was really what I saw myself doing. And he was curious, what did I want to do next? And I said very specifically, I want to launch a news organization. So this was back in 2016. Mm-hmm. And not just any kind of news organization. So, at the time, this was when Trump was running, and the media had become more polarized than it had ever been. There was a lot of big cultural shifts, especially with the culture war you see with people like Milo Yiannopoulos getting banned from campus or from multiple campuses. Yeah. A lot of different controversial figures that you could see there was something very different going on, and I've been paying very close attention to it. Watching a bunch of different people on political YouTube, from Dave Rubin to Jordan Peterson to Sargon of Akkad, all these different types of people, and I still didn't think there was anyone out there that was, when it just came to straight news and not commentary, was doing a great job. But then come February of this year, 2019, I saw a guy named Tim Pool on the Joe Rogan podcast. And his name had popped up before in the past, but I'd never seen him until I saw him on the Rogan show. And, I really appreciated the interview he did on there. And afterwards, I checked him out on YouTube, listening to his commentaries. And I liked his approach to news, to covering things, to be as balanced as possible. And, he's notoriously known as the milquetoast fence sitter. Yeah. And I think it's good that he owns it. But one other thing he talked about was this other company he was launching called Subverse News. And the idea behind it was to have unbiased reporting, to be deliberately dry in reporting, to get to just what the facts are, to not put spin on things, and ultimately let the viewer decide. And I loved that idea. And when I started watching their videos, it was interesting to watch or to read the responses are the comment sections on Subverse. And if anyone knows anything about YouTube comment sections, they're usually the worst places in the world, other than maybe 4chan.
Yeah.
They get pretty ugly. But on Subverse, it was mostly people saying like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe there's people doing old school, dry journalism. This is fantastic." So you could see there's people that are very hungry for something like this, and it was very much in tune with, what I had envisioned, years ago of when I said I wanted to launch a news organization at some point. So in April, I reached out to Tim. He had a call to action of, he's saying they're going to start hiring soon, and I wrote this long proposal of different ways, I wanted to help out Subverse, especially how I wanted to help them build their first satellite studio here in Chicago, because they're based on the East Coast. And I got a quick response from them within a week. I was talking with Emily Molly, who's the head of content, one of the other co-founders of Subverse. And yeah, now I've been working with them for the past few months, and what's been going on with Subverse has been incredible. This summer, there was a equity crowdfunding round that they did, and I believe they actually set a record. So just to specify, if people aren't familiar with equity crowdfunding as opposed to crowdfunding with something like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, through equity crowdfunding, you're actually investing money. You own a share or shares in an actual startup. So when Subverse did this, they raised over $1 million in under 24 hours. And, I think that also helped to validate how important Subverse ultimately is, and just the broader need to have something like it. And that this market, I think this is just the beginning, because right now Subverse is only, relative. It's only 150,000 subscribers on there, which is still a decent size for a YouTube channel. But in comparison to other people, I don't think anyone was expecting Subverse to raise over $1 million in 24 hours. And what that also means is you have a bunch of people that are willing to invest more, or that are willing to, support Subverse into the future. So it's very exciting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like, from what I heard you say, you kind of got into journalism, even though it wasn't something like it definitely hasn't been something. It sounds like you didn't study it in school. It wasn't something you were thinking about your whole life. You didn't grow up watching, CNN or Walter. I mean, obviously not Walter Cronkite. You're far too young. But, or anyone in particular, it sounds like you just kind of felt like there was a need for more objective reporting. And so you just wanted to kind of jump into that world. Is that accurate, or?
Yeah. Well, so back when I was starting Valkyrie, I mentioned that, I wanted to launch a news organization. At the time, I wasn't even thinking so much about being a journalist. It was more about, building one and finding other journalists to be, to create a new platform. But over the past few years, I've had other stories that I've wanted to tell, and I've had multiple movie scripts and TV pods and stuff I've been working on. But there are things I was like, I don't feel like they're ready yet, but there's other stories I want to tell. And I felt like I wanted to give journalism a shot. It's not anything I'd ever done in the past. It wasn't what I studied in film school. I didn't do any documentary or anything like that. Nothing similar. But I figured, why not give it a shot and see how it goes, especially with doing expert interviews, talking to interesting authors. And it didn't really matter the space, because I'm someone that's always constantly learning. I'm always reading at least one book at a time. I feel like I usually have like 3 or 4 going. But I thought it would be fantastic to have a chance to actually speak with these people and to interview them. And I feel like what could be a better job than doing something that you love. So
yeah, absolutely. It sounds like, you're in it for the right reasons, in that you want to do really objective reporting and talk to people that need to be talked to. How would you grade the news media, sort of the legacy media, the establishment media? And, I mean, like New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, kind of the big dogs. I mean, Subverse is great. I'm really glad you're involved with Subverse. I really enjoyed their content, and I've been looking into them. How would you grade the legacy media as it stands right now in terms of how they're handling things and how they're covering things?
Is abysmal a grade?
Absolutely. F-E.
Yeah.
Failure.
Yeah, I think the state of the media, it's been bad for a long time, long before Trump was running. And I think when things became much more polarized than they had been in the past. But, as early as I'd say the 2000s when I started to watch the news pretty consistently. And back then, it's funny, if you watch something like MSNBC, before the Iraq war, they were pushing for it. And then once Kerry was running, all of a sudden they were against it, and they kind of switched, and they kind of became a counterweight or counterbalance to Fox. And CNN, for the most part, had kind of stayed in the middle and had been like that for a while. And then slowly over time, MSNBC became more progressive, and it was definitely the alternate to Fox, and CNN still tried to stay more or less in the middle. And back then, I think both sides were bad. I don't think they're anywhere near as bad as what they are today, where it's gotten to the point where it's like no one cares about the facts. All they care about is viewers, and they'll do whatever they can to do that. And a lot of that comes from just smearing people, taking them out of context, and just ignoring what people have actually said, and to do it in context.
Yeah. When you say as bad as they are today, when do you think was kind of like the shark jumping moment for the legacy media? Like, is this something you're talking about the last 3 years since the 2016 election, or do you think it goes back a little further, or is it after? Like, when would you kind of make the cutoff of this is when the legacy media became abysmal, when it became just a dumpster fire?
So leading up to Trump being elected, it was starting to go that way. But then after he got elected, especially between CNN and MSNBC, they completely lost their mind. Or even if you're talking about print media,
it was all hell broke loose, right after the election.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't to say that I think Fox has been immaculate or anything like that. They have their own share of problems, but I think between at least the three networks, I think they've been the better of them, but I don't know if that necessarily means a whole lot.
In a land where the pygmies cast tall shadows, they say.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a low bar for cable news right now.
For sure. But I guess I was also happy to see the media become such a, I don't know if I can use a technical term, a shit show, because you have what's been happening on YouTube, especially independent media, the rise of independent media. It's just fueled by mainstream media nonsense. There are people, once they get to see what's out there, when they see on YouTube, especially, or on podcasts and stuff like that, once they see that there's an alternative, they're like, oh my God, just get me away from this nonsense that I'm hearing. But at the same time, you also do have large segments of society that cling to one particular show on one particular station, or they just watch one station all day long, and it's all about confirmation bias. So it's a double-edged sword. You certainly there's positive parts of driving people away from it, saying, I'm just going to tune out, which in some ways can get people to disengage, but it also drives them to other alternative platforms. And I think it's been inevitable that the mainstream media would start to die at an even faster rate it had already been going. So
yeah, I mean, so do you think that that's kind of, you're talking about these alternative forms of media, podcasts and new media like Subverse, that is obviously very YouTube centric. Somebody like Philip DeFranco definitely comes to mind. I'm a big fan of him. I name drop him a lot. I think he's him and Tim are really kind of the people that I've looked to recently and been like, they are keeping it alive for me. But what I want to ask is, are these alternative news sources, podcasts, YouTube, people like Philip DeFranco and Tim Pool and yourself at this point, do you think that's the future of news? Like, do you think that that's where things are heading, and that's basically the future of media, and that everything else is just going to kind of die off?
I think one thing we won't see a lot of is, I think YouTube is going to change substantially. I don't see how there's too many alternative people in the alternative political YouTube space that I don't think can survive YouTube, especially for people in the U.S. I know it's different how search results work in different countries, but if you live in the U.S., YouTube is trying to direct you to corporate sites, whether
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
CNN, MSNBC. You've got people like, whether it's Tim Pool or Steven Crowder or David Pakman, different sides or people in the middle that are alternative, that they're no longer, they don't show up in recommended feeds anymore, or even in search results. I saw Steven Crowder went through. You had to go through like 70 pages or something
Yeah.
of search results to actually get to his channel. You could find other people talking about Steven Crowder, but you couldn't actually find him. And,
Shadow banning.
Yeah. That's something that is certainly escalating, and I do think you will see alternatives.
Yeah, I've been wondering at one point, I hope that Going Dark will actually have the honor of getting shadow banned. Like, I hope to become big enough that YouTube will target us at some point. I feel like we actually have the privilege of kind of flying under the radar until we get to that point that we're actually big enough that they notice us, and then they're like, oh, we can't let this happen. Got to get rid of that. But yeah, I want to ask, what do you think the future is of? I always kind of have this conversation, and it's really had in the context of like national news, because that's obviously what people pay the most attention to, and it's by far the most sensationalized, I would say, for sure. What do you think is the future of local news? That's something that we've talked about on the show before and come up with some interesting ideas around things like volunteer reporting. What do you think is the future of local news? Because it's a very different thing.
Yeah, I think clearly, if big media is failing, it's even harder for the smaller people to try and survive. Yeah. I think for a time period, you're going to have basically no one reporting, and that's going to bother a lot of people. And at some point, you're going to have people that are going to come together and say, hey, we need to, whether it's going to be for profit or nonprofit, we need to try something new. And I think whenever you have a market like that, you're going to have a bunch of different experiments happening simultaneously. And at some point, you'll find something that works. The problem is right now you have people that are clinging to old models that aren't working. And you have people that have been there for a long time that don't know how to innovate or are just so hard-headed they won't even try. So there hasn't been, I think, a lot of space for someone to say, oh, here's how we're going to try and revolutionize this space. But one of the things I think what will happen at some point is right now, if you look at Lyft or Uber, that a lot of people do, they do it as a side gig.
Yeah.
Or for some people, it's what they do full time. But I think in many cases, people use it as supplemental income. Well, in the next 10 to 15 years, what will happen is you have automation of driving in most places. And all of a sudden, those jobs are going to be gone. So what are some other things that people can do that that automation will potentially always struggle to do? And that is journalism. I think you'll have people that can do this on the side, and I think it's important to start to train people to do those things.
Yeah. So yeah, because that's very similar to something that we have talked about, which is, you're talking about sort of this idea of the part-time journalist. I mean, somebody, especially for local news, it'd be very hard, I think, obviously, if you're part of a really large outlet, you wouldn't be part-time. But local news is something that does not pay a lot. I know people who work in local news, actually, back in my home state, and they've told me how much they get paid, and it's really awful. They get treated really poorly, and it's getting devalued to the point where they're almost working for free. I mean, it's really, really appalling, and it's because there is no money. Like, people are getting laid off and getting paid like crap in local news because there is very little money in it. Everything is owned by giant media companies that the only way they can turn a profit is to combine the profits of several different markets. Like, almost no newspapers are truly independent. They belong to these giant conglomerates. But yeah, I think that you're seeing a lack of valuation in local news, and then also people have more access to the resources to be news people. And so I think this idea of the part-time, maybe even volunteer reporter, I think it's becoming something that could very much be a reality. I mean, hell, that's how a lot of people on YouTube are starting. I mean, when Philip DeFranco first started his show, he was basically a part-time gossip journalist. Now he's like the Walter Cronkite of our generation. So I do like this idea of, it's interesting how you put it, like Uber or Lyft, because that's, I think, an interesting parallel, and that's something that's obviously very common right now. And I think if we got to a point one day where it was like that, that would be, I don't know. It doesn't. If when you first say it, the idea of a volunteer journalist or a part-time journalist, it sounds absurd. But the more you think about it, you think about where things are trending. I think the evidence points in that direction because there's no money in it. And the other thing is, and I've said this, and I know this would be controversial with some friends of mine. It's not reporting is not that hard. Like it's not the hardest thing in the world. Like I would say it's hard to be a really great reporter. It's not hard to be a decent reporter. And so if you have a market where maybe it's a town with only 10,000 people and there just isn't that big of a talent pool to be the local news reporter, you can find someone who's just decent and has, a camera and a laptop and understands the basics of journalistic ethics. And it's something that I'm very intrigued by.
So one of the challenges that I see, Ryan, is that the profession of amateur journalist seems like it's problematic in a number of ways. You said yourself that it's kind of a challenge to make sense and seek truth, that it's not like an easy, natural thing to do. And so I'm a little concerned, and maybe have some thoughts on the quality of amateur journalism, as well as potentially the impact of amateur journalists to end up, say, serving somebody like the interests of Jeff Bezos.
Sure. So I think you have to differentiate between, let's say you're watching some footage that someone posts on Twitter, some random person, they were at some crazy event happened and they posted it up there. In some ways, that can be considered journalism. You have a raw feed, as opposed to someone that's like, I'm going out there to tell a story. I think if you're someone who's deliberately going out there as a reporter, as a journalist, that takes time to try and develop those skills. And one of the things we've talked about at Subverse is, so one of the projects I'm working on, a story I'm covering, is about the future of education. Okay. And I'm someone who's always been about challenging whatever societal norms are there, especially in the education space. When it comes to the university system, I don't think it's sustainable. And people that are going to school for 4 or 5 years to become a journalist, they're wasting tens and thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to do so. I don't think you need that amount of time to try and learn how to become a journalist. And one of the things in the process of working on this new project about the future of education was, what if we could create a boot camp for journalists? I've worked a lot in the startup space, and something that's big here in Chicago is coding boot camps, where people will learn how to code within, let's say, 6 months to a year. And by the time they graduate, they already have a job, or they create their own job. They create their own startup. I don't see why, for someone that wants to become a journalist, with today's technology, if you have a smartphone, you've got an HD camera, you can go on Amazon or where else to get a decent, audio recorder and other equipment. And you got pretty much, you can go on YouTube or Vimeo or wherever, you can post and share your stuff, and anyone can pretty much create their own studio if they want. The barrier to entry previously, 10 years ago, 20, especially 30 or more, it was pretty much impossible for someone to try and pick up and do that. But now, I think because when we look at how journalists, especially like on cable news, are portrayed, they have celebrity status, they talk to all these high profile people, they sit down with presidents and prime ministers and all that kind of stuff. And you think, oh, well, they went to this prestigious school, probably. Not to knock any of these people. It doesn't mean they're not good at their job necessarily. Some of them are. Some, I would say, aren't the greatest. But it doesn't mean there aren't people that have innate storytelling skills or stuff that they've used elsewhere, where they feel like, I could do this as a journalist. So, like, just as an example for myself, prior to joining Subverse, I had never done anything like this. When I was in film school, I was doing, as far as what we did as projects for school, we had to do an experimental film. Didn't have any dialogue, and it wasn't stuff that I really wanted to do. Or even for my other startup, Valkyrie, I did some promo videos for it. Not quite, journalism. But I've been, a writer for a long time and working on a lot of stuff and helping to, as a marketer, sell the story of different companies and stuff like that. But when I did my first piece for Subverse, I was like, I don't know how this is going to go, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I wasn't like terrified, like, oh man, I might be in trouble. It was like, I'm really not sure, but I think I felt like my skills would translate into the space. And, when I was going to be interviewing people that, I have experience in doing improv, and, it's something that's very popular here in Chicago. And I feel like some of the skills I got from that as well, of when you're in the middle of a conversation, and specifically if you don't have a lot of time to interview someone, you're kind of time constrained.
Yeah.
You need to try and extract the most you can out of that, 2 to 10 minute, interview you have with a person, because a lot of people that you're trying to talk to, you have multiple people that all want interviews with them, so you don't know how much time you have to get through it. But also, you have to frame questions so that you don't hear you, the journalist. You can have the person speaking basically reform the question while they're speaking, to kind of keep the video, once it's pieced together, it makes it much easier to digest. So it's kind of for someone that's not used to it, it's kind of counterintuitive of how you would have like a normal conversation with someone.
Right.
I think that can take time to get used to that. But if you have other skills, outside of it, I don't think you have to be formally trained to be a journalist.
But what about, say, like the mentorship that you get at a place like the New York Times, where you're working with people who are very, very experienced in this field? Or, something like, what about a set of journalistic standards? I think with computer programming, you can make it very clear as to whether a piece of code runs or doesn't run, produces the expected result or doesn't produce the expected result. Like, it's a very clear yes or no, this was successful. So I think in the example that you used with programming boot camps, it's pretty clear whether a piece of code runs or doesn't run, or produces the expected result or doesn't produce the expected result. I think with journalism, it's a little more abstract, or potentially even longer term consequences as to whether or not somebody is doing a good job or not. And so maybe part of me worries a little bit, well, if we move to a completely decentralized platform, say without standards or without, say, some measure of integrity, potentially that leads to a more chaotic situation, and maybe even more chaotic than we have now, in terms of people just seeking out others whose quote unquote facts agree with their worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when it comes to standards, especially the people that claim that they have them, or the ones that have set them in place, they've been betraying them for so long. If we're worried about people that have been doing it professionally, they think, oh, that could happen to amateurs. Sure, that's possible. I'm sure it's going to happen. But at the same time, I think because we have these kind of false narratives constructed in our head, is how much it takes to be a good journalist, or to do some sort of basic reporting. I think it takes a lot less time than people realize. It doesn't mean you can't still have standards. I mean, Subverse certainly has standards in what we produce, and we're not just going to take anything that someone sends us. There's certainly a filter, but that doesn't mean, like, just to give an example. So for me, like I said, I didn't have a formal training in this. Sure, I've worked cameras before, and I've done editing, all that kind of stuff, but it was something new for me. You've got other Subverse contributors like Sean, who his background, his formal training is in psychology, but he dove into something that was totally new for him, and I think he's been doing a great job, and some of his videos they've been doing fantastic. Actually, pretty much everyone at Subverse, minus Emily, who runs, she's the head of content. And obviously Tim, but he's been actually less involved with Subverse. He's actually more focused on his other channels. He will be producing some new content coming up soon. But Emily, she's Emily Molly. If you check out the stuff she does, if you want to be a journalist, you got to be pretty brave, especially if you're going into some hot territories. And that's not for everyone. She was just recently in Hong Kong, and I think you can, if you watch the video for yourself, you can hear how incredibly harmed and hurt she was going through it, dealing with tear gas and being sprayed with this horrible blue ink that the cops spray on everyone so that they can
Yeah.
arrest them later. That was basically giving her like chemical burns essentially, and she felt like her whole body was like in a sense burning. I don't know if that's for everyone, but at the same time, you don't need everyone to cover those types of stories.
Right.
I think there's plenty of stuff where people can say, hey, I know about this, let's say, free speech protests or something like that, the culture war. That's on the minds of a lot of people. If you say, I'm just going to show up and talk to people, what you can extract from that, even if you're not a good storyteller, you can pass that to a good editor who can piece those things together and say, what is the story? Because, when I went to the men's rights conference, I talked to, I interviewed like 6, 7 people, and I had a general idea of what the so-called story was going to be. It was about the men's rights movement and how it fits into the culture war. When you have a bunch of different people, you don't know what they're going to say. You need a way of figuring out what are things that connect them all together. How do you piece it together into a story? It's one thing you can have multiple people do different things. You may have someone that say, hey, I don't like going out into the field. I'm not good at talking to people. I don't feel comfortable with a camera. Or maybe I'm only good with audio. I want to help, I want to be the audio person on, to help you out or whatever. But then you have someone else that comes in and says, I'm a great editor. I know I'm a great storyteller. I can weave this all together. I think it's a matter of helping people find where they actually fit.
Okay.
And when it comes to standards, I think most of them are arbitrary to begin with. And it all falls on what are the people, what are the viewers, what are listeners, what do they think? Do they feel like this is acceptable? But also the people you're interviewing. If you have a history of smearing these people, or they'll be like, that's not what I said, or you totally took that out of context, that helps to weed people out and for people to say, well, who's actually covering these people properly? And I think that's why people are attracted to Subverse, because we've talked to a lot of controversial people, and people have seen other stories about them, and they'll say the same thing. Like, they're shocked that you're willing to talk to these people and have, honest conversations,
Yeah.
and not to smear them. So I don't think there is no perfect standard or easy way to weed people out, other than over time you can have, it's just how the market works generally speaking. If you have good people, they'll continue to get more and more coverage. People will feel comfortable being interviewed and say, oh, this is a journalist I should talk to because I have a message I want to express. I know they're not going to try and smear me, as opposed to, oh, this person that is, quote, has been verified or has a blue check mark
Right.
on Twitter. He's been, or she's been verified. They hold to a certain standard. I don't think that means a whole lot ultimately.
All right. Yeah, and I like your point about journalists only being one piece of this puzzle, right? And that they just take one part of the role, but they really fit into a much broader umbrella of editors and producers and people who are ultimately, reviewing and publishing the content in the end. And I guess while you were speaking, I was also thinking about, it sounds like there certainly is appetite for the type of content that you're producing. Do you think it's quite large? Do you think this is something that's really lacking, or are you potentially worried that just the truth doesn't have a home and people are kind of going out into the internet just primarily to seek confirmation bias, and maybe we're more the exceptions rather than the rule with regards to truth seeking and sense making?
I think there are separate markets. There's people that purely want confirmation bias. There's always going to be a market for that. And I don't know good ways to necessarily stop it. But at the same time, also, humans are generally conformists. So if you can make it more popular for people to think outside the box, to be uncomfortable, with potentially, changing their mind on something, if they see other news sources like Subverse and what we're doing, and that starts to spread, people may say, hey, I should start trying new things. I should listen to more people that I disagree with. But I think until you create that base culture, it's hard to get other people to come to that side. But, with what the so-called intellectual dark web has been doing between, Rubin and Rogan and others, I've noticed there's a lot of people that people have been hungry for this. They may have felt when they used to watch more partisan stuff, like, I don't really fit in to what this is talking about, but I don't know where else to go. So there's certainly been people that have quickly adopted stuff that's, I don't want to say centrist, but I feel like when you have people that are just open-minded in general, like they want to hear varying viewpoints.
Yeah,
Sorry,
the thing that I just wanted to jump in because the thing that I worry about with this, in reference to this idea that you have people who are going after confirmation bias, you have other people who are interested in sense making and truth seeking, and that the intellectual dark web and organizations like Subverse are trying to kind of fill that void, that niche, that desire. The thing I worry about is just that, like, from what I can tell, it seems like it's, maybe 10 or 20% of the population is interested in truth seeking, in sense making, and the vast majority of people really are not. They're either rather apathetic or they are actively interested in, using news as ammunition in the team sport of political battle. And I'm curious to ask both of you, Ryan and Peter, what do you think the future? I mean, for me, the future just looks so bleak in that I feel like genuine truth seekers are outnumbered by a lot. And I wonder how that could be overcome, if at all. Or perhaps one of you disagrees with me and you think that I'm lowballing how many people generally are seeking the truth.
Well, from my perspective, I've been hearing a lot of people reference Harry Frankfurt's work on bullshit, and that sort of, especially in America, we've seen just an exponential growth in bullshit for decades now, and it's sort of reaching.
I love the idea that somebody's like, the bullshit is out of control. Like it has reached uncontrollable levels.
But I think in a way, like, Trump is the culmination of all that bullshit and I think it has so many different sources in terms of whether it's corporations funding scientific studies, or, I mean, you just read articles on the internet and it's like, who knows who paid for this article. Like, I know in my elevator at work, they have all this pro diamond mining propaganda where they're like, oh, diamond miners last year educated 300,000 women in Sub-Saharan Africa.
Jesus.
And it's like, it's so, that is such a transparent example, but I'm sure there's far less transparent examples. And I think just the decline in trust of, I think I know a lot of people who, they just throw their hands up and they're like, well, there's a million different voices out there and they're all screaming different things, and I just don't know how to make sense of it. So I think part of it might be building organizations that have that trust once again. And I think that could go a long way. I mean, I think what Ryan was saying, that there is a hunger for this, and it takes a long time to build trust and potentially not very long time to lose that trust. So
is there enough of a hunger, though, to overcome the tribalistic side? Like, is there enough, like, at the end of the day, like, will these sort of altruistic media pursuits be sustainable through the age of bullshit? Like, can it survive?
I mean, I think when you have, the president going around claiming fake news and touting conspiracy theories, part of me does think that we've gotten so good at hacking the human brain with regards to just elaborate conspiracy theories and grabbing onto different biases that humans have. And this capacity has been, again, growing for decades, and especially with algorithmically generated content, with potentially foreign actors trying to get in our social media and in our heads. It's, we're outgunned sort of as, like, individuals, and it's hard to see it. It's hard to see it getting better. So I think a good first step is building more reputable organizations. But wow, like, one scandal could just take it down, or one lawsuit, right? I mean, if you have, can you really resist an army of lawyers who are determined to take you down? I hope so, but I'm worried about the current state of affairs in a lot of ways.
You know, I think when it comes to older generations, the older you are, the more likely you are to stick to whatever you believe. I mean, there's very few people who will say they aren't truth seekers. I think most people are in denial about that. I think one of the main problems is we're not taught at an early age how susceptible the human mind is to being irrational.
Yeah.
And to actually be in the habit of trying to challenge your biases and to figure out, where do my beliefs come from? A lot of people just accept things blindly. And I think if you get in the habit from a very young age, it makes it much easier in the future to figure out, to keep an open mind. If you start with an open mind, it's much easier to keep it. But, whether it's at age 35 or 50, like, I don't know what the specific cutoff is for certain people where they're like, their brain's just always going to be that way. Their beliefs on, especially about really big issues, people aren't open to change, and they'll always just stick to whatever makes them feel comfortable. So it puts us in a really tough situation, because if you can't change old people's minds, then that means part of the problem is a waiting game, because at some point they won't, this sounds terrible, they won't be here anymore. But
part of me is worried just that you say learning at an early age, but I feel like we're outgunned in terms of the forces amassed against us, against our individual psychological capacities. We have giant corporations doing A/B testing to see which essentially digital product is more addictive, and especially since you work in this, and you're actively competing against some of these very sensationalist sources. And I wonder how much of that do you see in terms of potentially people coming to your site, looking at some of the content, thinking that it's pretty good, but then kind of going down a rabbit hole that's just full of conspiracy theories.
I mean, with how quickly Subverse has grown, and other prominent YouTubers, whether it's Dave Rubin, I think is probably one of the best examples. I mean, Joe Rogan, prior to the IDW kind of forming, was already a fairly good size, but Dave rose really quickly. You look at Jordan Peterson, how many places he's sold out. I think there's a strong silent minority that has been thinking about these things for so long. It's gotten to the point where they're just thrilled that it's finally here.
Yeah.
And I don't see a reason why that can't continue to grow. I guess referencing back to dinner, we're talking about how many people you talk to. If you mention someone like Dave Rubin or Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, they'd be like, "Who the hell is that?" Be shocked. At least I'll be shocked that people haven't even heard of him. I can understand if they don't listen to the Joe Rogan podcast and hear people talk about DMT and other fun substances and stuff like that. But then if you share something with them, they'll be like, "Oh, this is fantastic. I really like this. I had no idea 12 Rules for Life was a thing." Or if you give it someone that book for a present or gift or whatever, or you send them a link from Joe Rogan show, something like that. Part of the problem is just general awareness of these things that are happening. I think when a lot of people are exposed to it, if they're already upset with how things are polarized, if they're given an option for this stuff, all of a sudden it changes. They're like, "Oh, okay, well, I'm going to start checking more of this stuff out." And I think that's where a lot of people go down these so-called rabbit holes. I mean, the New York Times did this bullshit story, I think it was over the summer, where they talked about some person that supposedly went on a right-wing rabbit hole, but then they ended up as a leftist, which I don't quite understand. It was a very weird smear piece. But nonetheless, it was, I think the core of it was how you had stuff like YouTube, which I think is actually the algorithm. Well, it keeps changing, and there's, I think, a lot of negative things. What's happened very, very recently, where independent YouTubers are being deranked, especially in the U.S. And then YouTube is trying to get more people to watch corporate media. But there is ways around that by actively sharing. And I think, subscribers of channels like Subverse, they know the importance of sharing stuff on social media, not just relying on probably the way they may have found Subverse in the first place, or someone like Tim Pool. It was through, the algorithm. They watched something similar previously. It's important for people that are interested in this type of media, that want to have these types of conversations, to say, I need to actively participate, even if it's something as basic as just sharing something on social media. And I know part of the reason why people don't want to share is you have a very vocal minority of people that want to terrorize you if you happen to either agree with some of these people or have some vague interest in them. They want to smear you as racist, homophobic, whatever. It's crazy what's happened to, I think probably Jordan Peterson's gotten it the worst out of the so-called IDW. But
Yeah, I think that actually talking about this phenomenon, among others, actually kind of gives me some hope, in that what it reminds me of is that these intellectual dark web figures and new media like Subverse and Tim and Philip DeFranco, these things have all succeeded despite a smear effort by legacy media. I mean, even I mentioned Philip DeFranco. He was included in that New York Times piece that you mentioned before that was just a total hit job on YouTube personalities and how they're supposedly gateways to the alt-right, which is utter nonsense. And that was the single worst thing I've ever read ever. That thing made me swear off the New York Times for life. That thing cannot even be called an article. I don't even know what to call it. But what I wanted to ask though is, like, I have a little bit of hope when I think about this now, because I'm thinking, okay, Dave Rubin, Jordan Peterson, all these figures, like you said, they don't have, they're not ubiquitous. They don't have universal name recognition. You can't go up to 100 people on the street and expect more than maybe one or two to know who Dave Rubin is, which is obviously pretty good in general. But it's not, he's not. It's not the same as like Anderson Cooper. But here's the thing: the success of Joe Rogan, and to a larger extent, people like Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson, they've been this successful in spite of all of the noise and all of the protests and all of the smearing and lying and misrepresentation and deranking and censorship and shadow banning. And what I'm thinking is, maybe sometime in the near future, there will be a point at which the tide has turned on some of these things. Maybe the legacy media loses some of its punch when it smears someone. I think it kind of already has. We're starting to see that happen. How could somebody like Jordan Peterson exist if the legacy media still, if people believed everything the legacy media said, Jordan Peterson, and for that matter, another figure who's very popular, PewDiePie, on YouTube, they would not exist, because as far as the legacy media is concerned, they're both, Nazis. They're both the worst things humanly imaginable. So I think that it's sort of, I think we have to sort of think of the level of exposure that IDW figures are getting in context of the amount of pushback they're getting, and that hopefully at some point in the near future, some things are going to change where, it's like the big one would be if there wasn't as much social media censorship. It's like, I always think like, okay, Dave Rubin has 1 million subscribers. How many would he have if he wasn't being deranked? Tim Pool has 600,000 subscribers. How many would he have if he wasn't being deranked? It's like, and I think at some point in the future, with things like ThinkSpot and Minds, that there are these social media alternatives that are cropping up. ThinkSpot from Jordan Peterson, and Dave actually, I think, is involved with that as well. I just wonder though, when we sort of cross that plane and get into sort of this new promised land of a world where some of these old institutions, like the old social media giants, we already see Facebook waning in influence with young people, the legacy media, once we've kind of crossed over into a new era that is more democratized and decentralized, maybe it'll really be like this next big, like, light speed jump for intellectual dark web types of content.
I hope so, but I guess there's two ways to censor the truth. One, you can just ban these figures from social media. The other one is you can just convince people to stop caring about the truth, and I think that's kind of what Trump has been so effective at doing. I mean, just today, you had a senator on national TV essentially claiming the vast FBI and CIA conspiracies, just total disregard for even the concept of truth. And that to me is even more scary than just the censorship, because I think in some ways the censorship of the IDW figures made them more popular. I think if people just stop caring about IDW figures, that's potentially a lot scarier world for me to live in. And I'm not sure if necessarily democratization is going to be such a panacea either, because there's, it seems like we can just fall right back into that same old pattern. And I think this first wave of democratization, that first promise of Silicon Valley, has kind of created the media dystopia that we see today. So maybe further democratization isn't necessarily the answer. There's actually one thing that Ryan said that I noticed myself, and now I have an explanation for it, in terms of the increased corporate presence on YouTube. And I'm seeing, like, I open up YouTube and I'll see like CNBC and Bloomberg, and these are news media outlets that produce relatively, I'd say, like, kind of plain, boring content in a lot of ways, and not very opinionated, not very interesting. And yet that ends up being a significant portion of, like, just the recommendations or the front page that I see. And so I wonder, like, that is obviously crowding out sort of smaller channels necessarily that I used to discover through that recommendations page. And now it's like, oh, here, so this billionaire talk about, this segment of the economy that is like struggling or doing great or whatever else. And it's sort of irrelevant relative to things that that would actually sort of like add knowledge and joy to my life, and kind of just like
there's this
bullshit
element
commentary.
on YouTube, unfortunately. I mean, the past couple of years, there's been two separate what are called adpocalypses. And that's because certain content is considered advertiser friendly. And I think that's the content you're identifying here, is that YouTube, the past 2 or 3 years in particular, has really been looking for ways to boost content that is really safe, which fucking sucks. And this is why. YouTube was a place for content that is the opposite of advertiser friendly. I mean, it was the wild west of the internet when it first started. It was this new thing where people were doing new and innovative things. And now they have these rules that create a very sterile environment where you're watching interesting videos and yet your recommendations are for CNN and Jimmy Fallon, which is about as dry and banal as it gets.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, because I think it just shows that I really just hope that there's some kind of advertising revolution at some point. And you know what? We've already kind of seen this. I think there's evidence that this might take place. When I say advertising revolution, what I mean is advertisers learning that content creation is different now than it was 20 years ago. That you're going to work with creators who are doing things that are not sterile, that are not safe, but that can still be really good for your brand. And the evidence of this is that I've seen sketch comics on YouTube that I watch who do really, like, politically incorrect, like really potentially offensive skits. They have big sponsorships. I just saw one of the funniest, like, skits I'd seen from somebody I watched named Long Beach Griffey. He's a really, really funny sketch comic on YouTube. He was doing a spot for some male grooming company that does like a something to manscape with, like a body trimmer, and he did a really funny skit about it. And I was thinking, like, man, this whole skit is super politically incorrect and, like, super ribald and blue, and yet it's a sponsorship. And I thought, like, this company is brilliant. Like, the fact, because they had to have signed off on it on some level. And I'm thinking, and I've seen this a few times where I see somebody who has very, very, what you would call advertiser unfriendly content, and yet they have sponsors. I mean, look at Steven Crowder. He's got plenty of sponsors. I mean, some of them are gun manufacturers, so that kind of explains that. But I think that hopefully, I think that the thing that really gives what you were mentioning, which is like CNN, Jimmy Fallon, all these kind of things where it's like, why is this being recommended to me on YouTube? I think what gives them power is the advertiser-friendly aspect. And I really, really hope that there's some kind of revolution where we work out this issue that has arisen with the adpocalypse, where everyone's like, oh, internet content isn't advertiser-friendly, so let's only advertise on content that is monetizable because it's completely safe, which is not the point of the internet.
Yeah, I think there's another challenge too in terms of, if you look at broadcast media that was done over airwaves that were originally owned by the government. right? And so they're auctioned off. Every different parts of the spectrum are auctioned off. And if you have, say, a network that you want to start, you can buy that up in an auction and kind of do whatever you want with it. Now it's all based on YouTube, right? And YouTube takes a cut, right? It's because they're the platform, and it's really, kind of changed the economics. I think when you were saying that, okay, well, you have certain sketch comics and Steven Crowder and other people who have sponsors, and is that sponsors for themselves, or is it sort of like an exclusive ad agreement? Like, is YouTube taking a cut of that? Because if you're sponsoring just an individual content producer, I'm guessing YouTube doesn't take.
So the sponsorships that I'm talking about go exclusively to the creator.
Right.
Ad rolls go to YouTube, and a very small portion of it goes to the creator, the AdSense. That's like pennies on the dollar for the creator. But if you put something in your video that's a sponsorship, like I was mentioning, that all goes to the creator. It's a great source of revenue.
But if YouTube, deranks you because you're not very, ad friendly to them, right? You're a very low priority for them, which means that you have less viewership, which means that your sponsorship isn't worth as much.
Yeah, but some people seem to have found a way around that, i.e. Crowder. So like Crowder gets deranked. Everybody knows this. He's been talking about it recently. Crowder gets censored. He gets deranked. And yet he still has a solid fucking audience because he has 4 million subscribers. You can't silence that. He's too big to fail. Paul Joseph Watson's the same way. Dave Rubin, to a certain extent, has become too big to fail. He's at 1 million plus subscribers. So I think that some people, I guess I wonder what the future of it is. So some people seem to have survived.
How many did Alex Jones have before?
Yeah, so that actually so that's a good point. So that's a good example of somebody who was big, like real big on YouTube. I think they had like 2 or 3 million subscribers, and he got completely taken off. But I think he left a big opening for them to justify that. I think that if they could do what they did to Alex Jones to Steven Crowder, they would have done it by now. They did demonetize him, but that's not really all that important at the end of the day. He very little of his revenue came from the AdSense on YouTube. So yeah, that's a scary thought. It's like Alex Jones was somebody who appeared to be, sort of like, oh, can they get rid of somebody with this many followers? But I just think that Alex Jones was a special case where it was so easy to justify removing him. Even if you don't think it's justified, it was easy enough to come up with the rationale that they had based on his actions.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, I've always thought, I think one of the biggest conservative accounts on Twitter, it's like in the top 5, is Ben Shapiro's account. He's got like 2 million followers. And I've always thought, what would happen if they just fucking banned Ben Shapiro?
Yeah.
Is he too big to fail? And I've always thought about that, and I do think it would just be pandemonium, or like if Tucker Carlson with 5 million, just got taken off Twitter.
Yeah, part of me wonders if you change the YouTube model or start a new company that does more like the TV spectrum, where it's just like, okay, you get a certain bandwidth on this website and it's yours to do with whatever you want. We're not going to interfere. This is your part of YouTube, for example. I think that would be a very different type of model than the one we have now, say more akin to Amazon Web Services or something like that. So I don't know, maybe an opportunity there to fundamentally reshape the economics of the media landscape.
I think eventually you're going to have a giant exodus, basically. Like all the major political YouTubers, people that have been around for years, or even some that have just been around, somewhat more recently, they're just going to finally call it quits. And, as far as network effects go, it doesn't take, if you get a bunch of these bigger YouTubers all to go onto the same platform and they manage to, in some small way, coordinate and say, we're moving over here to, you guys mentioned Minds. What was the other one?
ThinkSpot.
Yeah,
ThinkSpot, which is in beta right now.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, and also full disclosure. So Minds.com, one of the co-founders of Subverse, Bill, he's also the CEO of Minds.com.
Oh, that's right.
So,
yeah.
I was gonna say, with what Minds has been doing, and there is quite a big YouTubers that are on Minds already, and it has been kind of like a backup for people where they say, if I get Alex Jones, if I get completely delisted from Twitter and all the other major ones, social media and YouTube, it's a good place for backup. And there's quite a bit of activity on there already, and Subverse posts there regularly. I do think you will continue to see that to grow. But also going back to what we were talking about with how do you get this movement to grow? You know, people that are interested in having tough conversations and that disagree. Because I think that's ultimately the most important part is people having conversations with people they disagree with, and not to think this person that has a different viewpoint is evil. I think that's probably the biggest thing. And what now, let's see, it was about a little over a month ago, Minds hosted an event in Philly, in the Philadelphia area, specifically about ways to reduce racism, violence, and authoritarianism. And Subverse was one of the sponsors, and also the people who set up the actual event is MythInform. They run MythCon. They're based out of Milwaukee. And the whole point of this event was to bring people that are interested in, you know, a lot of different people in the IDW, but bring them together into a physical space to not just have these conversations that they've had on Facebook and in comment sections on YouTube, but to be, you know, face to face and to see what happens and to try and come up with possible solutions and stuff like that. And unfortunately, the initial venue that it was going to be at is in New Jersey. It got canceled because of threats.
Wow.
There was someone who hacked the Twitter account of the theater and basically demanded, until you cancel this event, you're not getting it back. There were some other threats. We don't know how serious they were about someone that was going to set the theater on fire or whatever. It was just like one random person. But there was still going to be protesters that not only just wanted to stop the event, but also the after party that was taking place at a local brewery that was literally across the street from the original theater. So last minute, the event actually got moved to a casino that was across the river in Philadelphia, from where, you know, the New Jersey Philadelphia border. And the fact that you had people that wanted to shut this event down because they said the speakers were a bunch of, you know, racists or they were Nazis, the irony of them calling the group of speakers. So you had people like, I think some of their biggest, the people they thought were the most controversial, they didn't want to speak, was Count Dankula, you know, Mark Meekin, Sargon of Akkad, you know, Carl Benjamin, and people they said were associated with the far right and stuff like that. But the keynote speaker of this event was a guy named Daryl Davis. I don't know if you know who he is, and for the audience, if they're not familiar. So Daryl Davis, he's a musician who happens to be black, and he de-radicalizes KKK members. He's actually de-radicalized over 200 Klan members.
Wow.
Now, I can't think of a better person you could possibly have to speak at an event like this, trying to end, you know, violence and racism, and to say, why wouldn't you promote this event and say, hey, you should check out Daryl Davis. He's found ways to deal with people that are, I would say, you know, some of the worst in society. It doesn't mean you shouldn't still talk to them and interact so that you can try and get them to change. It's when you put these people in positions where they feel isolated and they feel attacked, instead of saying, let's sit down and talk about why you have these crazy beliefs. And that's what Daryl would do. He would have dinner with, you know, these high-level Klan members, and over time, they would start to see Daryl's humanity and be like, wow, all of those nonsensical things I learned when I was younger, it was all a bunch of nonsense. And at some point, you know, he got these people to give up their robes and say, I'm done with this. Why would you not want more of that? So I think at the end of the day, there needs to be more of these types of events. They don't have to be on the same scale necessarily, but I think it's also up to people to start to have, you know, smaller conversations, you know, at home, or, you know, start meetup groups and stuff like that. And the more you start to interact and see it in person, it's not just this vague kind of nebulous thing.
Yeah. To get people to give up their blue hair in the social justice mob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like we need to have a strong and, I think, palpable, something that is tangible to people. We need to have a strong movement for civil discourse and freedom of speech. And to a certain extent, that's what the intellectual dark web is. But then part of me just thinks, I don't know, is it branded properly? Is it branded at all? Like, the intellectual dark web is such a sort of loosely defined thing, but it's the closest thing I can think to like a civil discourse and free speech movement, which is so needed right now, because the fact that an event like the one you were describing, Ryan, met the kind of pushback that it did, it just shows the need for some kind of organization behind the efforts to counteract that. I mean, people need to support those kinds of events where you're going to have someone like Daryl Davis share their incredible story, and you're going to have people who disagree building consensus and forging a path forward, because the way the media operates right now, whether it's social media or news media, it is not working.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think there's very little, I'd say, activism component to what the IDW is trying to do, where it's a number of media figures who have perhaps taken the burden on their shoulders to promote free speech and spread these ideas. But Ryan was saying, that how many of us are going out there and actually speaking to people with very different viewpoints on a given day? And I think there's no shortage of those people who need that type of conversation. So perhaps more engagement like that. And maybe another part of the problem is, in America, we've self-segregated into like-minded geographic cities, right? And there aren't a lot of places where you actually have, I'd say, very drastic viewpoints intermixing. And maybe that's just another challenge, where the only time you interact with a lot of these people is in the YouTube comment section and, in the Facebook news feeds.
Yeah, and there are less things that are able to generate what you might call interpolitical relationships or friendships. I mean, a lot of the things that kind of bring people together, regardless of politics, where politics is kind of irrelevant, like, gaming. Like, two people can be playing a video game together and they don't know who's a Republican and who's a Democrat. They just both know they really, really like Fortnite and that they're playing Fortnite together and they're having a good time. Football. They don't know who's a Republican or who's a Democrat. They both know that they're rooting for the Bears or whatever, and so they're both having a good time, and they strike up a friendship. And maybe politics gets spoken about at some point, but they've already established, a relationship, so it's not that big of a deal. I think those things are being politicized. It's like there's less room for, because you were talking about, people of different viewpoints getting together, and how that's just becoming so difficult, though, because everything is politicized. Gaming is politicized. Football is politicized. And it almost seems like that's intentional. Like, if everything is politicized and the prevailing, political correctness of the day leans a certain way, then everything is going to lead people in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And it seems very intentional.
I mean, this is the arc of radicalism pretty much everywhere, right? You delete the lines between the private and the public spheres and make everything political, kind of force people into, whether it's identity groups. Standard playbook, played out historically many times with not awesome consequences sometimes. But, I think there is something very, particularly with people who have, I'd say, really kind of like gone off the deep end, and kind of just sitting down with them and humanizing them. I think I've had conversations with people who they convince themselves that they were wrong just by trying to articulate the view, which they just couldn't articulate. And I think sometimes you end up stuck in your head, and as soon as you try to take what's in your head and speak it, you realize it actually doesn't have much substance.
I think a big part of the problem there might be that we teach people that it's a horrible, horrible thing. It's the worst thing imaginable to be wrong or to admit that you're wrong. We make it seem like that's got to be the most painful thing in the world, and it's humiliating, and you should never subject yourself to it. Whereas I think we should have more. You see some admiration for people who take responsibility for a position or something that they did that wasn't quite right, but there's a lot of people just saying like, oh, look at them. They're fucking, they're admitting they were wrong about this. Now I can never trust them with anything ever again. Instead of giving people
very generous take on what can happen. You can get sued. You can have your livelihood taken away from you.
Yeah.
Admitting that you're wrong is actually a very potentially a very costly mistake.
And yet, whenever you ask
Publicly.
anyone, what are like the cornerstones of being an adult, a lot of people will say, I think it's someone who can take responsibility for their actions and admit that they're wrong. Like, we know this. On some level, we know this, and yet we don't really act like it.
If a doctor admits they were wrong, I mean, they'll get sued, right? I mean, that's the first thing you're told in a lot of these positions of power or authority, or where you're just opening yourself up to sort of any sort of legal or other backlash. So, I mean, that might be part of it, where there's just, I'm sure there's a lot of people who genuinely feel wrong and would like to admit that they're wrong, but because of various social forces, or if you post that you're wrong on the internet, somebody Googles that and it's there forever, right? And so it just kind of creates this culture where you just deny everything.
I think in some ways you have people that I can understand, especially for a doctor, if they say they screwed something up and it ends up with someone dying or whatever, they can get sued or something like that. But generally, people would be surprised how much harm they won't receive, or actual potential praise, if they're willing to be vulnerable and just say, I am wrong. I think a lot of people do appreciate, because they know of the potential consequence of it, because I'm sure they've experienced it themselves. And I think the more you can get people to do that, they can start to do it in their own life as well. I think something that's really important is to go back into your own life and think about what things you've been wrong about. And you could have changed your mind a lot on certain political issues or religious or whatever it may be. And let's say if you go back, if you're in your 30s, you go back to your teens or something that you were taught from a young age and you didn't think twice about it, that you used to believe that now you think is horrible. Would you want to just hate that person? Would you want to be treated as a terrible person for that belief you had at that moment? Or would you think, I want to give this person an opportunity to change, and notice that you used to be that person and you wouldn't want to be treated horribly? I think that's how you have to think of anyone now that you think is generally a bad person. When someone, going back to Daryl Davis, he was willing to give these people a chance, that people that said he wasn't truly human, that he was, basically garbage to them, he would just sit there and take that. And I think it's not an easy thing to do, but you can see what an incredible impact it can have just by giving someone that chance. So if you have someone that's not actively trying to kill you, that you have a chance to say, look, I think you're wrong. I think you're terribly wrong, but I think there's something redeemable in you. I've been wrong about things. I wouldn't want to be treated horribly. I'd want people to give me a chance to change. Let's just have a frank conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that every single one of us at some point in our life needed to mature and grow. I mean, every single one of us, however long ago it was at some point was an infant shitting ourselves in our diapers, and our parents had to put up with it and it'll help us grow and learn how to use the toilet, first of all, but then a number of other things that would make us better, more mature people. And it's like, that's life, is that we grow. And some people grow a little faster than others, and that's okay.
Well, this is actually a very Christian message. And I think what you were saying is actually quite lovely, Ryan. My critique of it would be, look at what happened to that conference, right? There's all these threats made against him, against what he's trying to do. Probably in no small part because of him being successful and him being kind of like a publicly open, good person, and somebody's out there and they take advantage of that and try to crush that. So it's kind of a beautiful message, and I worry about the reality that it exists in, and sort of some of these. I feel like people like him might be particularly vulnerable to those types of attacks, precisely because of, say, maybe this idealism that they have, which I don't want to lose. I think it's very important, and I think forgiveness is something that's also really important, kind of this Christian idea, which, it's easy to be wrong if you know you're going to be forgiven. If you know you're going to be crucified, it's much, much harder to be wrong.
Yeah, for sure. There's one other thing I wanted to add. So this event I was referring to, the Minds in Real Life event, the one in Philadelphia. So me and my colleague Sean from Subverse, we were covering the event, and we went and talked to some of the protesters that showed up for the after party. They were protesting the after party, which is back in New Jersey. And it was tough to try and get some of these protesters to speak and to figure out, like, we honestly just wanted to find out what made them show up. And a lot of them didn't want to be on camera, and which was fine. We got some of them to talk off camera. The common theme seemed to be, they heard some stuff on the news that sounded super negative. They thought Nazis and white supremacists were going to be there, so they wanted to show up to protest. And then some people were just curious. They're like, we're in kind of a small town. There's not a lot of crazy stuff happening here. We're just here to see what's up. But for someone like me, but before me and Sean, we were crossing the river from Philly back into New Jersey, knowing that we were going to be filming this protest, where they think there's going to be Nazis. I half joked to Sean saying, because I have a shaved head, because I am a bald person and I have blue eyes, I'm worried that someone's going to think, oh, this guy's probably a neo-Nazi. Them not knowing the fact that I'm half Jewish. And not that it seems to matter these days. You have people like Ben Shapiro, who is an Orthodox Jew, and he still gets called a Nazi. But it's even
Clearly
worse.
a Nazi with his yarmulke. I've never seen a more Aryan person in my life.
Right. Well, so for me, I don't have a yarmulke. I don't even know if it'll stick on my head very well. So, but not 30 minutes later, by the time we arrived, some guy walked up to me. He's like, "Hey, Nazi photographer." I had a DSLR camera that was, dangling from my neck. And I was confused when he first said it, and then he kept walking towards me. He's like, "Hey, Nazi photographer, I'm talking to you." I was like, "Did you just seriously call me a Nazi?" And, my initial reaction was like, this is potentially very dangerous, because this guy, with his tone, was trying to be intimidating. And if he thinks I'm a Nazi, he feels like he has the right to attack me. So I was like, I'm going to do everything I can to try and diffuse this situation. And all I said was, I was like, I fucking hate Nazis. And all of a sudden he kind of like stopped, and he's like, oh, sorry, dude. Like, I totally thought you were a Nazi. I was like, no, I shave my head because I'm basically bald everywhere. It makes it much easier to just do this. He's like, oh man, all right, now I feel really bad. But like, just the fact that because you had all these nonsense reports and things that were, talked about in the media, hopefully that was a learning moment for him to say, you know what, I need to stop being prejudiced against people that happen to be bald. For all he knows, I could have just done, multiple rounds of chemo and I lost all my hair.
That should happen. Samantha Bee called some kid like a skinhead, said he had like a skinhead look to him, and it turned out he had cancer. That happened on the show. Yeah.
It's really scary. But you see what happened to Andy No. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, absolutely. We discussed it on the show.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So Andy was one of the speakers, and that was one of the people they said Antifa and others keep smearing him as this Asian man who also happens to be gay.
Most of the Nazis were like 5'5" gay Asians. I don't know if you've read your history books, but from what I recall.
Yeah, it's so he was one of the other speakers there, and it was just insane. And little did they know that after I was interviewing these people, and this guy called me, the Nazi photographer. At the end of the night, the best thing about covering this whole event is I got to actually interview Daryl Davis, and it was surreal. I've seen his TED talk. He did a TEDx talk for Naperville, which actually is my hometown. And it's one of those things, it's hard not to bring you to tears. Like when you hear the lives that he's changed and how simple it is to get people to change, you just have to reach out to them. And, I hope the people that were outside that were protesting, some of them got to see, his work and what he's doing, because I think, honestly, Daryl Davis is the key to this whole thing. He needs to be everywhere. His message is, I don't know how you can argue against it, because who else could? It would be one thing if he managed to convince just one Klan member, but it was 200, and it was, a lot of the the top people. So when someone says, I'm going to be violent with people I disagree with, they're just making bad excuses because there's clearly a much better path to do this peacefully.
So, as we're sort of talking about new media and where media is headed, I just wanted to ask you about where maybe Subverse fits into all that. Obviously, you're a good person to ask since you are doing work for Subverse right now. Where do you think Subverse kind of fits into the new media landscape?
So one of the main ideas behind Subverse was to be decentralized. So we've got people all across the country or even the globe that have been doing reporting. And for a lot of them, they're also not doing it full time. And I think that's important. If you're someone that's maybe even doing freelance journalism on the side or it's something that's interested you, now's the perfect time to do it because maybe once a month or once a year you have some big story that comes to your town and maybe you typically don't have time to travel, but there's some big event on a weekend. You're like, I got a camera, I got a mic, I'm gonna go talk to people, and now you have an outlet like Subverse that you can supply it to. And I think that's a big part of it. Or where the future of media is ultimately going. But, going back to business models, how do you make this thing work? So using ads on YouTube is definitely not reliable. I mean, even if
Not
you...
at all.
even,
Not even a little bit.
Yeah. Even if you are monetized, you're probably not making a lot unless you're a really big channel. And plus it's not reliable. And actually the worst part is, if you are relying on those dollars from AdSense, you have to be careful with what you say. And if you're a news organization that wants to get to the truth, which can sometimes lead to controversial past that advertisers don't want to talk about or don't want to be associated with, you end up silencing yourself. So you need to find other revenue sources or other forms of advertising potentially. But I think ultimately you can't just rely on advertising. You need to look for other revenue streams. Like I like to look at what Philip DeFranco is doing.
Yeah.
He sells, I'm going blank on the name of his brand name items.
Oh yeah, it's the different. He has a big merch line. He also has Rogue Rocket, which is like an actual media company, sort of in the vein of Subverse, somewhat similar.
Yeah, so I think it's important to find other products and stuff that you can sell that you also have control over, that you don't have to rely on someone else all of a sudden saying, well, we don't want to be associated with you anymore.
Yeah.
We
Well, it
feel
can
like
even
you're
happen
too
on
controversial."
Patreon. It's funny because Patreon is like the other place that you can go to fund things. And Patreon, like they kicked off Sargon of Akkad, Milo Yiannopoulos, Lauren Southern. So, and hopefully, I mean, God, people sell their merch on like Teespring and stuff. I haven't heard of any problems with them. But
Yeah.
there's like no safe place where they won't just say like, even if you, feed your kids, like Sargon of Akkad, I think he's, Carl Benjamin's feeding his kids from Patreon, or at least he was, and they just kicked him off. It's brutal.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely you got Subscribestar, which is, trying to be more of a free speech platform alternative to Patreon. But even still, you don't want to rely on one thing because let's say if there's another recession soon and all of a sudden people that used to donate, consistently, all of a sudden that money's gone, you're in trouble. So to me, the most important part is to be diversified in your revenue streams.
Yeah.
And I think that's something for any news organization in today's age, you have to do that. I do think subscription models are also important, and there's some people I think have been doing it well. Blaze TV, what they've done, to also aggregate a bunch of different people that are kind of intermixed between conservative and libertarian and somewhere in between. But other than that, there's very few people that I think are really nailing it. But I feel like with what Subverse is doing, we have something special that we can really grow because we have the people that are already watching us. They truly love what we're doing. And I find, going back to the comment section, when people talk about how much that they like us, when they just discover us, it's the same thing. People are just genuinely shocked. And if they're not finding it anywhere else, who else are you going to try and support other than us? So
it's like they're like, we have found journalism in the wild. We have found the rare actual journalist in its natural habitat.
Exactly. No, it's sad that it's come to that, but I couldn't be happier, to be working with Subverse and what's going on moving forward. So.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and I've obviously watched some of your work, and I've been watching Subverse lately, and it is phenomenal. It's it's funny I know the biggest name generally I think associated with Subverse is Tim Pool, and you were talking before about people they are getting demonetized and they have to switch things around. I'm a big fan of Tim's and Subverse at this point. I noticed that even Tim Pool on his channel, he does great work. I'm a huge fan of his, but I noticed, and he's very transparent about it. He says it every time. He's like, if he gets to a point in a story where he has to say the word Nazi, what he'll say is, you see him kind of roll his eyes and go like, I can't. He just goes,
bad guys from World War II.
Yeah. He has to do that because he's trying to keep his videos monetizable. I think Tim Pool has somehow survived and been able to have at least some of his videos monetized, and he tries to keep that revenue stream going. Lucky for him, he's had a great. Ever since Rogan, he's had a huge amount of subscriber growth. I want to say around the time he went on Rogan to talk to Jack Dorsey and his attorney/PR lady, he was at, I think, like 350,000 subscribers. Now he's at like almost 700,000 or something like that. Like he's had huge growth since then. And I think hopefully it puts him in a position where at some point he doesn't have to scrape up the AdSense on his channel. I don't blame him at all. I just hate seeing even somebody like Tim, who has so much integrity, having to sit there and be like, not Nazis. He's like he said, he's like the bad guys from World War II. And he's kind of got that half smile on his face because he knows how ridiculous it is. And like you can't say gun too. I think you're supposed to avoid saying gun. You have to say like thing that makes shooting. Like,
yeah.
It's like so awful. People are
Object that
working
goes
around
bang.
it. Yeah, I heard there's one guy I really like named Chris Raygun. And one of the reasons I like him is because he went out of his way at one point on his channel to say like, I will not be doing that. He said, I will say, he's like, I'm going to say fuck, cunt, shit, like gun, murder, Nazi, white supremacy, all the fucking words that will set off that automated system. I will say it all. He's like, I will not be a part of this like sterile nonsense. And I was like, good for him. And he I think he's like mostly Patreon funded, I would guess, because he definitely doesn't get any AdSense. He gets jack shit from his AdSense, and he's not as much of a media guy. He's somewhat of a commentator, but he's more of like a comedian. Do you know Chris Raygun?
Yeah, for sure.
He's awesome.
He's hilarious.
Huge fan of his.
He did a great song parody to Lady Gaga.
Punch a Nazi,
Yeah.
Parody of Paparazzi. He's fantastic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, there's this whole new world of people. And when I see something like Subverse, it just makes me think about how it's growing. And this is a whole entity. And also, something like Philip DeFranco's Rogue Rocket, or like Rebel Media and all these media entities. Even Steven Crowder has a staff. Dave Rubin has a staff. He just put Kyle Kashuv on his staff. It's like, I just love seeing this whole world grow. And, learning about Subverse and seeing it, initially I'd only heard of, Tim Pool, but then I learned about Subverse. And it's just great to see the sphere of truth seekers grow. And that's, you can call it the intellectual dark web, you can call it whatever you want. But, when we just kind of ran into you out of nowhere, it was actually Peter who just kind of like met you. It was just really cool to like, we ran into someone in the wild who's kind of associated with this new thing, the new center, the intellectual dark web, the, whatever you want to call it. It's great to see it grow, and it's great to see an organization like Subverse. Tell me a little bit about your experience with your first story for Subverse. What was the first thing you worked on, and what was that like?
Sure. So the first thing I did was it was a men's rights conference that was here in Chicago, and it was quite an interesting experience. And when I was prepping for it, because I had no experience of being a journalist, and I've watched a lot of other people do it, I kind of try and think to myself, how do I want to cover this? And for most of the people that were speaking were very controversial, and I've seen them been smeared, countless times. And I was like, I just want to talk to these people and let them say what they actually believe, and to let them speak in context. And if people find something negative from that, that's fine.
Yeah.
Other people may say I agree, or they're kind of stuck in between. But to mainly focus on what do they actually believe, because I've seen so many things get twisted, and there's nothing that drives me nuts more than someone to get smeared. I know, just like for someone like myself, so for me being a libertarian, There's a lot of people that disagree with me. Both the right and the left hate me, and
Yep.
and a lot of people in between. Or there's other libertarians that don't like me because I'm either too far right or left or whatever of them. And but to me, the most important part is if you're going to have a discussion, at least understand what someone actually believes, so you can argue in a productive manner. If you're too focused on arguing against something that someone isn't, you're just wasting time. And then there's also the fact that I think it's a huge injustice when you take someone out of context, or you strawman them or you smear them. It just drives me crazy. And that's why I was thrilled that Subverse was, I pitched this idea to him, or to Subverse, and they allowed me to just say, go for it. And it went really well. So, the main reason I chose this men's rights events was not the fact that it was about men's rights. It was who they were inviting to this event. It was a bunch of people involved in the culture war. And, going back to Gamergate, which I think is the main inflection point of when the culture really started to shift, I noticed that a lot of these men's rights activists were a huge part of that. And I think a lot of people, they don't notice that. But it was interesting, the people that have become, front and center in the culture war, people like Sargon of Akkad, also known as Carl Benjamin.
Yeah.
He was one of the speakers there, along with Count Dankula.
Yeah.
And two people that they joined UKIP and became politicians, and have, they've had these kind of
Unsuccessful, unfortunately.
Sure, but nonetheless, they've been very influential.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I wanted to try and connect the dots between how these two people, or these two groups, political YouTubers and these MRAs kind of came together, and how they were associated with Gamergate and the general culture war. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I've seen that video, by the way. It was the first, when Peter told me that he'd ran into you, I looked up your work, and that was the first thing I found, and it's great work. It was just, and it's, I just think about how you said that you pitched this to Subverse, and they were like, yeah, go for it. And I'm just thinking, like, man, there are not a lot of outlets where you would pitch them, I want to do, like, actual coverage of the men's rights. Like, if you pitched, I want to cover a men's rights forum or convention to most outlets, they'd be like, well, you got to make it like a smear job, basically. Like, this has to be, editorialized so that it's, a bunch of dirty sexist men. Whereas it's great that you work for an outlet that would actually let you cover that and actually, like, give it a fair shake and just cover it like you really should cover things.
Yeah.
Because it's an interesting world. I mean, I'm not super well versed in sort of the men's rights activism world, but I know that there are certain things that I can really, really sympathize with in the men's rights arena. I mean, obviously I am a man, but beyond that, there's just a lot of things recently. It hasn't been until recently that I really started to think that maybe some kind of men's rights apparatus would be necessary, but recent developments have changed my thinking on that. So I'm just glad I'm really glad you did that story. It was a really great piece of work.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. Just to, say with Subverse, the thing I love is I can pitch my ideas to them, but they'll pitch ideas to me.
Yeah.
No one dictates and says, you're going to go cover the story, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important for a journalist to be like, I want to actually take the time and put my heart into a project and not feel like you're just there to get a paycheck, even though you hate what you're covering or you're not interested. So it goes both ways of me saying, hey, I think this person's very interesting. I would love to do, interview them. And actually, so far, I don't think I've had one story idea that's gotten shut down. So hopefully, as long as they like my ideas. But nonetheless, there's nothing coming the other way saying, you must do this.
Yeah,
and I think that's very important.
And I think that's any journalist's dream. Anyone who's interested in journalism, their dream is to cover what they want to cover. Like, everybody has their area of interest. Some people want to cover government, some people want to cover sports, but they all start out having to cover, dog shows, like the local dog show or whatever, because they got to work their way up the ladder and start in local news or whatever it is they're starting in. And a lot of times that leads to kind of that awful scenario where they're not having stories pitched to them, they're having stories assigned to them, which, maybe is just sort of a natural part of the job, but it really sounds like you're kind of living the dream as far as somebody who wants to get involved with this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty cool. It sounds like
Absolutely.
a great organization to be a part of for sure. Yeah.
No, for sure. And that's why, we always ask people to reach out to us. And we already have, multiple, independent journalists that are working for us. So people should reach out to us if they have stories they want to pitch.
Well, Ryan, I hope people check out your work, including your interview with Daryl Davis, among other things. Ryan, where can people find you on social media?
So on Twitter, you can check me out at RyLazShy. And I'll give you guys all the details and stuff. But be sure to check out Subverse News on YouTube. And also, if you guys haven't checked out Minds, I highly recommend, people look at Minds.com. I think it's a great, alternative platform. Like I said, full disclosure, one of our co-founders at Subverse is also the CEO of Minds. But honestly, I think you guys should check it out. So.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Ryan, for joining us. I want to thank all of our listeners here. This has been Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. If you enjoy this content, please let us know what you think in the comments. If you don't enjoy it, do the same. Just let us know either way what your thoughts are in the comments. Please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content. We are also on iTunes and Spotify. Thank you again for listening.